Good morning, everybody. If you guys have your paper Bibles, let's go ahead and get those out. We're going to open up to Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. Word. Boom. Big 16, little 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven."
Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing? We're doing good, doing good. All right. Well, worship felt fantastic. I'm not going to lie to you. I did not participate in the 9 o'clock, and it felt so good at the 9 o'clock. I was like, do you mind if I just join you guys? It just felt so good. Let us never take for granted the opportunity to come together in community and worship our God. Amen. That we would never fall into a routine where that we take that for granted. Such a beautiful, special, sacred time together. It always feels so good. Well, I'm excited to get into the teaching today. Last week, we've been going through this series for several weeks now, but last week we kind of took a little bit of a pause in the overall narrative of the story. So that we could cover a pretty big theme in the Bible of the tabernacle and the temple. There's so much within it that is spread throughout the whole book, but it was a little bit deviating from the overall story that we've been covering. And so today we're going to kind of pick back up on that narrative that we've been going through for weeks. And so just a quick reminder, a little recap of some of the things, the consistent cycles and themes that we have seen throughout the Old Testament up to this point. And first off, we've kind of covered that there seems to be a cycle, if you guys recall, that we start with chaos and nothingness, and God enters the picture and he brings about life and peace, and he creates these things, these good things. And then as humans, he wants to partner with us to reflect him and to trust him and partner with him in doing life together. Inevitably, we end up getting in our own way, and we end up being deceived, and we end up taking for ourselves from our own desires. So we take for ourselves, leading us down a path of destruction, down a path of chaos. And God, his loving self, would always come into the picture, typically partnering with a particular family that we've been covering. And he redeems things, and he brings them back to where he desires them to be, how he created them all along. And that cycle seems to happen over and over and over again. All throughout the Old Testament, right? We've covered several of these stories of how this man would step up and then no, here we go again. And then this man would step up and then here we go again. The cycle would happen over and over again. Another thing that we've discussed is that there is a dilemma throughout the story that is underneath all of it. The dilemma between life and death. It started with either the tree of life or the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Are we going to surrender to God's love and trust in him? Or are we going to take for ourselves and our own desires and try to control things? Are we going to freely give of ourselves to give life to those around us, or are we going to take from those around us? Several weeks ago, we talked about, are we going to be the seed of the woman where we produce good fruit like life and joy and peace? Or are we going to participate with the seed of the serpent? And so we see these themes, we see this happen throughout the story. And like I said, we've really covered all of the Old Testament in a relatively short period of time. So it has been fairly high level. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it and got enough of something that has grabbed your interest and intrigue, that as you've been meditating on the scriptures, you're beginning to see new ways of seeing his word. And today, I'm excited to say we get to turn the page from the Old Testament to the New. And yes, and we get to talk about the one, truly the one that is to come and fulfill all things. That is, shocker, Jesus. Do you know that? Jesus. So we get to talk about Jesus today. So as we flip to the New Testament, it starts with 4 gospel accounts of Jesus. And all of these gospels are to point to Jesus being the one that we have been waiting for and anticipating. But it's kind of cool to see how each of them do it. Matthew starts his book with the genealogy of Jesus. Just the actual seed, the actual lineage, he starts with to show that Jesus is the one. There's 3 sets of 14 generations at the beginning of Matthew. The first one goes from Abraham to David to signify that the nation of Israel is rising. The second set is from David to the Babylonian exile, showing Israel now falling. And then from the exile to the Messiah, Jesus, that redemption takes place. So within the genealogy itself, we see this cycle that we just went through. When we go to the book of Mark, Mark starts with the prophet Isaiah, a prophecy from him. And throughout the prophets that we just covered toward the tail end of the Old Testament, these prophets were telling the people of Israel, the one, truly, he's coming. Just keep believing, have hope, have faith. He is coming. And so Mark starts by going back to one of the prophecies to say, you know, all those prophets and prophecies, well, here we go. We're going into it. The one that they've been talking about is here. We go to the book of Luke. Luke starts with priestly temple language, which we talked about last week, tabernacle and temple. And he starts with this type of language because there is one to come that's going to be the chief priest. There's one that's going to come that will replace the temple. And lastly, John. On John's gospel, he starts with a retelling of creation. When we go all the way back to the very beginning of the book in Genesis, it starts with, in the beginning was God. And John starts his book by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Isn't it cool to see how each one of them takes a different perspective or vantage point, all pointing to Jesus? All that we've been covering has been pointing to the one and only Jesus Christ. Awesome stuff, right? Jesus is born. He comes into this world. It is Emmanuel, God with us. We talked last week, the tabernacle was a way that God could come and dwell with his people. And now we see Jesus being born. God is with us. But he's born into a chaotic mess of a world. Back to our cycle. It starts with chaos. The world at this time is under Roman rule, and they have violently dominated the world at this time. And so this is the world that Jesus is born into. And not only, are the Romans dominating and violent as they do, even the religious leaders of Israel have begun to be corrupt and collude with Romans so that they can hold their position of power, whatever power the Romans allow. And so they, too, with their pride, with them wanting to maintain status, with them wanting to maintain for themselves, they are doing things that are not best for God's people. This is what Jesus is born into. And because of the condition that it's in, the angel of the Lord comes to Joseph, Jesus' dad, and he tells him, you need to go to Egypt because you need to go to save your life. And what's interesting is he tells him to go to Egypt, which I don't know about you, but as soon as I read that this week, my ears started ringing with, haven't we been here before? Long, long ago, Egypt was a place of bondage, of slavery for God's children. But now, it's a place of refuge for Jesus. Jesus being born just a baby, and yet he's already redeeming things as he goes to a place that was once bondage. But like Jesus being born into this place, it reminds us of Moses back in Egypt. Moses, too, as a baby, was born with Pharaoh ruling the world, ruling their place of living. And Pharaoh, if you recall, makes a command to kill all of the baby boys of Israel because he was in fear of being overturned by the Israelite people. They were starting to outnumber them. And so he gives this brutal command. Can you imagine? I mean, it's hard to even fathom making a command so violent and so evil to kill all these baby boys. But Jesus now is in a situation much like Moses, where King Herod makes a command to kill all of the baby boys 2 years or younger because he wants to keep his position that he's in. For fear of losing his position of power, he gives this evil command as well. We're going to see parallel after parallel because the whole story has been pointing to him. So Jesus grows up. We don't have a whole lot that we read about with Jesus growing up. It kind of makes you wonder, what was that like? Little Jesus growing up. But we fast forward to right as Jesus is really stepping in now to ministry and into his calling. And it starts with Jesus going to be baptized by John the Baptist. John the Baptist has been called to prepare the way for Jesus. And so when we look at Matthew chapter 3, verse 15, Jesus comes to John the Baptist. He says, baptize me. John the Baptist says, yeah, no, that doesn't make sense. I got no business baptizing you. But Jesus replies by saying, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. This is what we have to do to fulfill all that has been talked about, all that has been written. So John consents. He baptizes Jesus. And as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. Just like we covered in the tabernacle last week, there was a cleansing of water at the basin. And at that moment, the heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. Reading about a dove calls me back to Noah on the ark, where Noah, the waters are starting to subside, and Noah releases a dove. And he releases a dove to figure out and find out, is this place a place that can have life again? In the same way, Jesus gets baptized, a dove comes down descending on him as if, is this a place where life can breathe again as Jesus enters the picture? So after he has the dove descend upon him, a voice from heaven said, "This is my son. This is the seed that we've been waiting for, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Jesus goes on from being baptized, and it says that the Spirit led him into the wilderness to be tempted. Isn't that interesting that the Spirit would lead him into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights? That also sounds familiar. Don't know about you. But Jesus finds himself in the wilderness, and the tempter comes along to tempt. Now, Jesus is fully human, all right? He's fully a human being. And I think sometimes we, I have to admit for myself, I struggle too, but it's kind of like we do this thing in our head. It's like, yeah, but he's Jesus, like he's God. So it's not that big of a deal for him, right? I want us to lean into the fact that he is fully human. He is a man trying to figure things out on earth. A man that has his own thoughts, his own desires. He has the emotions that he shows us throughout these stories that we read about, where he weeps and he grieves for those that he loves and he has compassion for. He gets angry at times. Like, he is a human being. This wasn't a walk in the park necessarily for him. He is, in fact, trying to show us what it looks like to be fully human in a way that we can rule over these things. We can rule over these emotions and these thoughts. We can rule over these desires that we have within us. So Jesus is in the wilderness, and he's fasting for 40 days, 40 nights. And so the tempter comes in and says, "Hey, Jesus, I know you're hungry. So why don't you see that stone over there? Why don't you just turn that thing into bread and then just reach out and take it? Take it for yourself and give what you need." It reminds me of Eve reaching out for food from the tree to get what she wanted or what she felt like she needed. But Jesus, instead, he rules over that thing by pointing to the truth. Because it says in Matthew 4:4, he responds by saying, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but only on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Not by bread alone, but we are to live by the words of God. We are to live with God. We are to walk with him, partner with him, just do life with him. That's how we live. These are words that God gave his people long, long ago back in the book of Deuteronomy. And so he's pointing to the truth of his word. Then the devil goes on to another temptation. He takes him to the highest point of the temple. And he says, "If you are the Son of God," which I don't know about you, that just doesn't sit right with me. Like, how dare, if I were Jesus, anyway, maybe it's just me. If you are the Son of God, then why don't you just throw yourself down off this high point in the temple? Because it's written, he starts using his words. It is written that you could just command the angels and they'll come and they'll save you. And Jesus points back to his truth of his word and he says, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Lastly, the devil takes him to a very high mountain, and he tells him he will give Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. Isn't that so kind of him? It's just kind of cute that the devil thinks he's in a position to be able to say, yeah, I'll give all this to you. I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you just bow down and worship me. He tempts him with such a human type of desire of power over all the kingdoms, the wealth of all the kingdoms, that the status of ruling. But in Jesus' case, he responds and says, get away from me, Satan. For it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. He takes all these temptations, the twistings of the deceiver, and he points back to truth. He shows us that we too can point back to truth, the truth of who he is, what he said, what he's done. When we need reminding ourselves, sometimes we just need to say it out loud. This is who he is. He rules over all of the desires. Then next in the book of Matthew, we quickly find Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount, where he is laying out what it looks like to now live this life with him and like him. He's turning everything, it seems like, upside down. All the things that seem like common sense to us, he kind of flips on its head. All the lowly among you will be the ones that get the reward, the heavenly rewards. But as he's doing that, he says, listen, I am here now. I'm here to fulfill this law. I'm here to fulfill these prophecies. This is what I'm here for. So when we talk about murder, the commands that were given in the past, the law that was given to Moses, I'm not just talking about avoiding murder. I'm talking about don't even have hate in your heart. I'm talking about loving your enemies. What? Yeah, love your enemies. So catch this. As we take a step back and we do a comparison of the Exodus story to the Jesus story, we know that the Israelites were freed from the Egyptians through the waters. They were saved. And Jesus comes into the picture and is baptized into the waters and comes up cleansed. When we look at the Israelites, they go through the waters and they are led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus, after being baptized in the waters, is led by the Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And lastly, when we see the Israelites in the wilderness, God gives Moses the law. It's put on a tablet, it's with them, showing them the way to live life with God in God's way. And we see Jesus going to the Sermon on the Mount, teaching and speaking about what it looks like, the ways of living like Jesus, fulfilling that very law. We see how he just continually fulfills thing after thing. But he goes on, continuing to live as a human, continuing to show us what it looks like to produce good fruit. He shows us through his life how we bring about more life. He begins healing people. Crowds and crowds of people were coming from everywhere to be healed. There was a man with leprosy that came to Jesus asking him to heal his leprosy. But as a leper, he was ostracized from the community because he was seen as unclean. And if you were to touch someone that was unclean, you too were then considered unclean. That's what it was. That's how we worked. That's how it was in this time. Jesus comes into the picture, and what he touches as unclean, he heals and turns into clean. He shows us that we can walk into broken things and we can bring about healing for others. Many of them would come screaming, Jesus, Jesus, Son of David, would you heal? Son of David, the faith that they had of knowing who he was. He is the one that they've been waiting for. That's what they were proclaiming as they're yelling out to him. And he would go on to heal because of their faith. Jesus, he cast out demons that were in people that were being possessed by things over their life, showing that he could rule over the enemy. He could rule over evil. He could rule over darkness. Jesus showed us what it looked like to multiply what is given to us by feeding 5,000 with just a couple fish and bread. He showed us what it looks like to reconcile with one another, living life together in unity. And when conflict enters, how do we work through these things that instead of division, we would come together and we would bring heaven to earth through living life together? At the temple, he turns over tables because his very temple had become a place where people were taking from others to fulfill their own desires, to get their own personal gain. And he says, no, that is not what this place is. And he restores it by saying, this is a house of prayer. This is a place of healing. Thing after thing, he is showing us, for us as humans, how we are to live by how he is modeling his life. One of the things that we've covered throughout this series is what the waters represent. If you think of the waters, the chaotic waters, water is not necessarily a place that works out real good for us humans, does it? We're not going to live very long out stranded in some water. So in this day and age, water was seen as a place of death and destruction and chaos. But Jesus restores it. How? Well, you've probably heard of a story where his disciples were on a boat working across the way, but there was this storm and this wind and the waters were just fighting against them, and they were rowing all night long, fighting against the storms and the waters. And then Jesus just comes walking on top of the water. As if it's just like, really? Like, you're worried about the chaotic waters? They're so beneath me. I have authority over this. One time he was in the boat with them, and they were so fearful for their life that the waters were crashing into the boat. They thought they were going to sink. They were fearing their very lives. And let me just remind you, many of them were fishermen that were very used to being on a boat. And so they are fearful for their life with the storm that's crashing against them. And they finally call to Jesus. Jesus gets up as he's sleeping in the boat. And he comes up and he speaks to the wind. He speaks to the waters. And he says, be still. And then there is peace that comes. He shows us that through storms, we can overcome them. When we have storms in life which are inevitable, when we have circumstances that we don't love, that with him, we can overcome the chaotic waters. We must continue to walk, seek him, and be with him. As we fast forward into the story, as we're approaching what we know is to come for Jesus, he is in a space with the Last Supper with his disciples. And they are sitting and spending this intimate time together within, let's just say, a tent. And he gets down and washes the feet of his disciples, cleansing them with the waters. Just as Abraham wanted to do for him way, way back when, Jesus is now doing it for his disciples. They have communion together. They break the bread. They have the wine, just as if They're in the holy place of the tabernacle or the temple, communing with Jesus. Jesus goes on to tell them, I am the true vine, and you are the branches. I am the tree of life. And if you just abide in me, if you just remain in my love, if you just spend time with me, be with me, talk with me, walk with me, we will partner together and produce so much goodness. We will usher in the very kingdoms of heaven, but just reside, be with me. Afterward, Jesus takes him to a mountain, Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. Takes him to a garden that's called Oil Press. And there, he goes off in private to pray to the Father, which he did many, many times throughout the Gospels, showing us what it is that we are to do as we need guidance, as we need him to step in and intervene. Jesus, knowing that he's going to his crucifixion, has to go to a place of solitude with the Father and cry out, say, Lord, if there's any other way, let's do it. But if it's your will that this is to be done, then let your will be done, not mine. I have to think that this is how many of those prayers look like. Father, I really want to do this. But if it's your will to do that, then I'm going to do your will. Jesus is, shortly after he's arrested, they come to arrest him in the middle of the night. And of course, Peter's got to do something crazy, right? He ain't going to sit by. So he grabs a sword and swipes at one of the servants of the high priest. And he gets one of the ears of the servants. And Jesus quickly says, whoa, 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 whoa. No, we're not doing this like that. I know that's normally how these things are done. I know we normally resort to violence, but that's not how we're going to do this. In fact, he says, if we were doing it that way, trust me, I got it under control. I still have all authority in this moment. But he actually went on to say, we have to do it this way in order to fulfill what has been said. So he reaches down, picks the ear up of his enemy, and he heals his enemy as he gets drug off to be beaten himself. Jesus is crucified on a tree. And here we go again. I would have to think his followers are thinking, man, I thought he was really the one. Here we go again. We got to go through a whole nother cycle of this thing. I thought he was the one. And their hope begins to slip through. They begin to lose faith in who they thought he was. They end up running and hiding into places in fear for their own lives. This is where we are again. Before we go any further, can you guys just join me? Stand to your feet. The next part of this story is going to blow your mind. You don't even know what's coming. I'm joking. I joke like that because, again, I think this is something we can just take for granted. Yeah, I know. I know this story. But see, when we look in John chapter 19, his followers were just broken. It says that at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And here is where his followers would come and cry and weep, thinking that it's over. It's not what we thought. And on the third day, he goes missing. His body goes missing all of a sudden. Mary Magdalene's at the tomb, weeping, confused, crying, what has been done? And it says a man began to talk with her, a man that she thought was the gardener. But this isn't the gardener that we read about in Genesis that deceived and led to death and destruction. No, this gardener is a different one. Because while all the other stories of all the other people that we have talked about ended in death, this one, however, ends in eternal life. Jesus overcomes death. The main powers that we had that started this story with sin and death, Jesus defeats both of them. He defeats sin at the cross. He defeats death through his resurrection. See, he fulfills it all. He truly is the one after all. The resurrection changed everything. When he went from death to life, the disciples all of a sudden puff their chest out a little bit. They come out of hiding and they say, you know what? It is him. It really is him. You know what? Let's live this life that he has taught us. Let's live this life that he has shown us. His kingdom has come. I said his kingdom has come. The cycle that was is no longer. The dilemma that we've been battling back and forth, he's defeated death. So come on, let's worship him together. He brings dead things to life, doesn't he? Come on, let's worship together. Let's put our hands together like this.